We start with one of the most severe humanitarian crises anywhere in the world right now. We have an extended report tonight from Somalia, where hundreds of thousands of people, many trapped by conflict, are facing extreme hunger and death after the worst drought in 40 years. Now, the Republic of Somalia, here in the Horn of Africa and the eastern part of the continent, has a long history of droughts. But the climate shocks are becoming more frequent and they're leaving less time to recover and to prepare for the next. The situation is made much worse by the presence of Al-Shabaab insurgents. They control quite a few parts of the country and they are making humanitarian work pretty much impossible. It's estimated that more than half the population affected by the current drought live in these very areas, and the situation here is getting worse and worse. A full-blown famine, where households have no food, children suffer malnutrition, people die every day from starvation, is now likely, say the experts, within a matter of weeks. Our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding reported on Somalia's last famine back in 2011, in which 250,000 people died. He sent this report from Baidoa, that is a city at the heart of the current crisis.
In a crowded hospital, the familiar and unbearable signs of famine. Gaunt faces, silent with hunger. Weak mothers willing weaker children to cling to life. Somalia has been here before, but in isolated Baidoa, doctors and nurses are bracing themselves for new depths of catastrophe. In your life, have you seen things this bad before?
No, the worst.
This is the worst?
Yeah.
The worst drought in 40 years as climate change ravages the Horn of Africa. 3-year-old Ali has been brought in with swollen limbs, a sign of severe malnutrition. He has measles too. His mother watches in silent dread of losing a third child.
So this woman here has lost 2 of her children, 2 girls, in the last week.
And already the hospital is struggling.
Sometimes we are lack of the supplies.
You lack supplies?
Yeah.
That must be incredibly frustrating.
Sure. When it happens, it's actually terrifying, actually, because people are dying and you cannot support them.
On the dusty plains around the city, more families arrive each hour and set up camp. Many have trekked for days or weeks. Across Somalia, 1 million people are making these journeys, bringing little with them, but stories of dead cattle, dead crops, and a rural way of life that a changing climate will no longer tolerate. Fatima walked for a fortnight to get here. She carried her 3-year-old for days, but the child died of hunger on the journey. We had to leave her by the roadside, she says. We had no strength to bury her. We could hear the hyenas closing in. Officially, no famine has been declared yet here in Somalia, but today, right now, 300,000 people are living in famine conditions, with another 2 million on the brink of famine. So it's hard to imagine a situation more desperate, more urgent, more compelling. There is help arriving here in Baidoa and plans for much more, but it's too slow.
The things we are doing now, we needed to do 3 months ago. So in reality, we are behind. I think something catastrophic will happen in this area.
Catastrophic, you mean famine spreading?
Famine is spreading.
But drought is not the only challenge. Somalia is at war, a long fight against a formidable Islamist insurgency.
There's fighting going on today just down the road from here. It's part of a conflict that's been devastating Somalia for the past 3 decades. And of course, in a situation of drought, it means getting access to rural communities is not only much more dangerous and more expensive, it's also sometimes simply impossible.
In some areas, pro-government forces are taking ground, rescuing trapped communities. But Baidoa itself remains more or less under siege, a precarious place of refuge. And while the men fight, it is Somalia's women who soldier on. Fatuma Omar recently buried her 10-year-old son Salat in the camp just here beside their makeshift tent. It's not much of a grave, but life has taught Fatuma resilience. She has 4 more children to look after. I cannot grieve for my son. There's no time, she says. I need to find work and food to keep the others alive. Listening to her is 11-year-old Diro. But the mention of his favourite brother is too much for him.
That heartrending report from Somalia by Andrew Harding. Well, Andrew is in South Africa tonight, in Johannesburg, and he joins us now. Andrew, you mentioned the urgency of this case and the fact that the appeals are being made already for help. What can you say tonight about the state of the humanitarian aid?
Well, the key question, of course, is if and when a famine is declared, because, of course, that triggers a huge international response. And there's been a tendency in the past for famine to be declared too late. You mentioned 2011 and Somalia's last famine. Well, it turned out that half of those who died during the course of that period died before a famine was declared. The encouraging news, though, is that Somalia has changed since then. For instance, every family basically has a mobile phone now, and the family you saw at the end there struggling, but they have a phone, and they're now getting cash from British, from other charities, from the United Nations directly to them. It gives them power, it gives them a sense of control over their lives, and it's much more efficient in terms of aid delivery.
You touched on these in your report, but tell us a little more then tonight about the factors that have come together again to produce this crisis.
Well, people talk, of course, about the war in Ukraine pushing up prices. That's certainly an issue. We mentioned there the conflict in Somalia. It's a war that's been going on in different guises for 30 years. And of course, that plays its part too. A very fragile country, Somalia. But fundamentally now, this is not just about drought. It's about climate change. And it's about now looking forward, finding ways for weak states like Somalia and across the region to build resilience, to access international funds. There's money available, but to find ways to shore up communities and to protect people as they're trying to cling on to their old ways of life, but also as they move under huge pressure now towards the cities, towards the towns, to make life there livable too.
Andrew, many thanks again. Andrew Harding there with the latest thoughts on the crisis in Somalia. Andrew there for us in Johannesburg tonight. For more updates, news and analysis from Andrew and colleagues, you can go and have a look at BBC Online, where there are latest reports plus analysis for you. Or, of course, you can switch and go to the BBC News app on your mobile devices, and you'll see all the links there as well.